How did Rick Grimes go from a chill young police officer dude to an almost crazy zombie destroyer? That transformation haunts me every time I rewatch the first episode. There's this moment when Rick wakes up in the hospital, and his hand instinctively goes to his deputy sheriff's badge, this small metal star that represented everything he believed in. Law, order, the promise that someone was in charge. He doesn't know yet that the world ended while he was unconscious, that badges don't mean anything anymore, that the institutions he swore to uphold are gone. But his hand finds that badge anyway, like muscle memory, like hope. What if the entire story isn't really about surviving zombies? What if it's about who we become when everything we believed in dies? Let's trace Rick's transformation together, gently, like following a path through quiet woods. Rick Grimes woke up to silence. That's the detail that always gets me when I go back to Season 1, Episode 1. Not chaos, not screaming silence. The hospital was empty, the hallways dark, and when he finally stumbled outside into the Atlanta sun, he found a world that had already ended without him. The CDC would later confirm what he'd discover piece by piece. This wasn't a local outbreak. This wasn't something the government was containing. The entire civilization that existed for thousands of years collapsed in weeks. Billions died. Everything that seemed permanent, governments, cities, the confident assumption that tomorrow would resemble today, all of it gone. Shane, Rick's best friend and partner at the King County Sheriff's Department, had a different introduction to the apocalypse. He watched it happen. He saw the military fall, saw the evacuation centers overrun, and Shane made a desperate choice that would haunt him. He went to the hospital to save Rick during the chaotic evacuation, but when the power died and he couldn't detect a heartbeat, Shane believed Rick was dead. He barricaded the door with a gurney, an act that likely saved Rick's life, and fled. Shane didn't abandon Rick callously. He left believing his best friend was already gone, and that staying would mean dying for nothing. This distinction matters because Shane learned something in those early days that Rick would take much longer to accept. The old rules don't apply anymore. Survival requires pragmatism, sometimes requires cruelty, always requires being willing to do what the old world would have called wrong. This tension between Rick's hopeful idealism, his belief that people can be better, that civilization can be rebuilt, and Shane's dark pragmatism becomes the show's foundational conflict. And here's the pattern we'll see repeated across all 11 seasons. Every time Rick tries to hold on to the old world's values, the new world punishes him for it. Every time he adapts and becomes harder, he loses a piece of who he was. In those early days at the Atlanta quarry camp, Rick believed in rescue. He believed the government would return, that scientists at the CDC would find a cure, that this was temporary. He organized people, established watch rotations, tried to maintain some sense of order and hope, but the world kept teaching him otherwise. The CDC in Season 1, Episode 6, TS-19, was supposed to be salvation. Dr. Jenner, the last scientist, running tests in a fortified facility with backup power. But Jenner had given up. He'd lost his wife to the infection, lost his colleagues, lost his faith that humanity could survive this. And when Rick and the group arrived desperate for answers, Jenner's mercy was to try to keep them there while the building self-destructed. A painless death, he called it. An ending, with dignity. Rick rejected that mercy violently, broke out, saved his people, chose painful survival over comfortable death. But something changed in him, in that CDC. The institution he'd believed in, government, science, authority, it failed completely. Jenner, the expert, had no answers. The facility designed to save humanity became a tomb. Rick learned that day, there is no rescue coming. There are no adults in charge. If his people survive, it will be because they save themselves. Shane watched this awakening with something like satisfaction. He'd already learned these lessons. He'd already become what the apocalypse required. And the conflict brewing between them over Lori, over Carl, over leadership, was really about which version of humanity would survive. Rick's hopeful idealism, or Shane's dark pragmatism. But here's the question that haunts me. When did hope become dangerous? When did believing in goodness, in rebuilding, in holding on to old world values, when did that shift from virtue to liability? Because the show will spend 11 seasons exploring that question, and I'm not sure it ever gives us a comfortable answer. After the CDC, the group fragmented and reformed. This is a pattern we'll see throughout the series. Crisis scatters them, but they always find their way back to each other. Because family, the family you choose, the family you build through shared trauma and survival, that's what actually matters. Not blood, not the families you were born into, but the people who stay beside you when everything else falls apart. They found Herschel's farm in season 2, and for a while, it felt like maybe they could stop running. Herschel Green, a veterinarian and man of faith, had maintained his property through the early days of the outbreak. He'd kept walkers in his barn, believing they were sick people who might be cured someday. That delusion, tragic as it was, had protected him. He wasn't afraid of the dead because he thought they could be saved. Lori was pregnant. That revelation in season 2 carried so much weight, hope, and terror in equal measure. A child growing in a dying world, new life as either promise or curse. Carl, Rick's son, was struggling to maintain childhood innocence in a world where innocence got you killed, and the group was forming bonds that transcended their pre-apocalypse identities. Glenn and Maggie fell in love. Daryl, the redneck loner who'd been nobody before the outbreak, found purpose and family. Carol, who'd been abused by her husband Ed, discovered strength she never knew she had. These weren't the people they used to be. The apocalypse was reshaping them. And sometimes that reshaping was growth, transformation into better versions of themselves. But Rick and Shane's conflict was coming to a head. Shane loved Lori, had protected her and Carl when Rick was presumed dead. In Shane's mind, he'd earned them, deserved them. And Rick's return didn't change Shane's feelings. It just added resentment, rivalry, the dark knowledge that in the old world, what you deserved didn't matter. In the new world, you took what you needed, or you died trying. The farm fell in season 2, episode 13, beside the dying fire. A massive herd, drawn by gunfire from Shane's death the previous episode, overwhelmed Herschel's property. The barn burned. The group scattered into the night. Andrea got separated, presumed dead, and they learned again, nowhere is safe. The moment you start believing a place is home, that's when it gets taken from you. This was their first real experience with loss of home, with a desperate flight from a place they'd started to invest in emotionally. The farm represented hope, agriculture, sustainability, maybe even a future. But hope made them visible, made them vulnerable. The safer they felt, the more dangerous they actually were. After the farm, Rick made a declaration that revealed how much he'd changed. "This isn't a democracy anymore," he told the group. His idealism was cracking. Shane's pragmatism was seeping into him. The burden of leadership, of making impossible choices, of carrying responsibility for everyone's survival. It was breaking down his faith in collaborative decision-making. And here's what I find fascinating. The show doesn't tell us Rick is wrong. Shane's ghost would haunt Rick for seasons. This voice in his head representing the dark truth that survival sometimes requires tyranny, requires one person making hard choices without consensus, requires becoming the kind of leader the old world would have called a dictator. The found family was forming, but it was forming in fire and loss. They kept searching for safety, kept believing that somewhere, somehow, there was a place they could finally rest. Not knowing yet that safety was the lie, not understanding that the search itself might be what destroys them. The prison in seasons 3 and 4 was Rick's first real attempt to build something permanent. Not just survive, not just find temporary shelter, but actually rebuild civilization in miniature. Clear the cell blocks, establish gardens, bring in other survivors, create something sustainable and defensible. The prison represented Rick's vision of what humanity could be after the fall. Organized, cooperative, growing. Herschel became the moral center of this community. He lost his farm, lost his leg to a walker bite that Rick amputated in Season 3, Episode 1 Seed to save him, but he hadn't lost his faith in human goodness. While Rick grew darker, seeing threats everywhere, hallucinating Lori after her death, struggling with the weight of leadership, Herschel represented the possibility that you could survive without losing your humanity, that mercy and wisdom still had value even when the world demanded brutality. But the prison attracted threats. That's the pattern. Build something valuable, and people would try to take it. The governor, leader of Woodbury, discovered them. And the governor represented a different survival model. Authoritarian control, us versus them mentality. The belief that your people's survival justified any atrocity against outsiders. The governor wanted the prison, wanted its security, its resources, its strategic value, and he was willing to massacre Rick's people to take it. This introduced the show's most important thematic shift. The living are more dangerous than the dead. Walkers are predictable, manageable if you're careful. But humans will smile while planning your murder. Humans will offer friendship while engineering your destruction. Lori died in Season 3, Episode 4, Killer Within, during an emergency C-section that Carl had to facilitate. Maggie performed the surgery with a knife, no anesthesia, no proper tools. Lori knew she wouldn't survive, said goodbye to Carl, told him to be strong, and Carl, barely into his teens, had to shoot his mother after she died to prevent her from turning. The cost of bringing new life into this world was Lori's death, and Carl carried that burden for the rest of his too short life. Rick spiraled, hallucinated phone calls from Lori, withdrew from leadership. The prison that was supposed to represent hope became a reminder of everything he'd lost. And the governor kept circling, kept planning, kept waiting for the right moment to strike. Season 4 brought the flu outbreak, and this is where we see the medication crisis foreshadowed. Herschel moved between the sick in quarantine, using elderberry tea because antibiotics were scarce, choosing who received limited medicine and who had to fight infection on their own. Daryl led a desperate run to a veterinary college 50 miles away, risking everything for animal-grade antibiotics because human pharmacies had been picked clean. People died from that flu. Not dramatically, not heroically, they just got sick and died because the medical infrastructure to save them didn't exist anymore. And the survivors learned, even if you build walls, Even if you grow food, you're still vulnerable to things antibiotics used to handle easily. The old world solutions were running out. The prison fell in Season 4, Episode 8, Too Far Gone. The governor returned with a tank, with an army, with ultimatums. Rick tried to negotiate, tried to offer coexistence. But the governor executed Herschel with Michonne's katana, murdered the community's moral center to prove a point about power and inevitability. The tank rolled through the fences. Walkers flooded in. The group scattered again, believing people were dead who weren't, separated in chaos. And here's the reflection that settles over this whole era. Every time they built something, the building made them visible to predators. Success attracted threats. The prison was supposed to be their salvation, their permanent home. Instead, it became another tomb, another lost sanctuary, another lesson that nothing you build will last. The road between the prison's fall and Alexandria was brutal. The group scattered, then slowly converged on Terminus, following signs that promised sanctuary for all, community for all. Those who arrive survive. It sounded perfect. It sounded like exactly what desperate survivors needed to hear. Season 5, Episode 1, No Sanctuary, revealed the truth. Terminus had started as a real sanctuary. Gareth and his people genuinely tried to help strangers, to build something good. But then raiders came, took over, brutalized them. And when Gareth's group finally fought back and reclaimed Terminus, they'd been changed, broken, reshaped by trauma into something monstrous. They became cannibals. The railroad cars where Rick's group was imprisoned, those were holding pens. The friendly signs, bait. Terminus survived by luring in survivors, trapping them, butchering them for food. The promise of sanctuary was a lie that got people killed. Rick's response to discovering this was primal. He fought his way out, burned Terminus to the ground, killed without hesitation or mercy. Because he'd learned places that promise safety often hide the worst horrors. Trust gets you killed. Hope gets you eaten. The only thing you can rely on is your own people, your found family, the ones who've proven through survival that they'll protect you. Bob died from a walker bite after Terminus. Tyrese, the gentle giant who'd struggled to maintain compassion in a brutal world, was bitten and died in Season 5. Episode 9. What happened and what's going on? The road was killing them slowly. Attrition through constant danger and exhaustion. And then Aaron found them. A recruiter from Alexandria, a walled community that had been protected since the early days of the outbreak. He offered them safety, food, shelter, a chance to finally stop running. And Rick's group couldn't believe it. After Terminus, after so many false sanctuaries, the idea of a real safe place felt like a trap. But Alexandria was real. Season 5, Episode 12, Remember, showed them entering a community that looked like the old world preserved. Solar panels, running water, houses with electricity, people who'd been protected from the worst of the apocalypse. It was everything they'd been searching for. Except it felt wrong. Rick couldn't relax in the shower, couldn't let his guard down even when washing away months of road dirt. His hand kept moving toward where his gun should be. His eyes kept scanning for exits, for threats, for the catch, because there's always a catch. The pattern here is about trust becoming a liability. Rick's group had survived by being suspicious, by assuming threats, by staying ready to fight or flee. Alexandria's residents had survived through luck and walls, and they didn't understand what the outside world had become. They were soft, vulnerable, and Rick's group knew that softness gets you killed. The emotional weight of this chapter is about what survival costs you psychologically. Rick's group couldn't accept safety even when it was real, because accepting safety meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant death. They'd been trained by trauma to never let their guard down, never trust promises of protection, never believe that anywhere was truly safe. Bob's death before they reached Alexandria represented hope lost. Tyrese's death shortly after represented compassion sacrificed. Both men had tried to maintain old world values, faith, mercy, the belief that people could be good, and the apocalypse killed them for it. The survivors who made it to Alexandria were the ones who had learned to be suspicious, guarded, ready for violence. And the terrible truth Rick was beginning to understand. Maybe the governor and Gareth and all the monsters they'd faced, maybe those people weren't aberrations. Maybe they were just adapting faster, accepting sooner what survival really required. Maybe in trying to hold on to goodness, Rick's group was fighting against reality itself. The institutions failed, the sanctuaries were lies, but the found family persisted, and that persistence came at the cost of ever truly feeling safe again. Alexandria in seasons 5 and 6 was civilization's ghost, a community that had somehow preserved pre-apocalypse life through walls and luck. But that preservation came with dangerous naivete. Deanna Monroe, Alexandria's leader, had maintained social structures, job assignments, community meetings. She was trying to keep the old world alive inside those walls. Rick saw immediately how vulnerable they were. The walls were inadequate. The people couldn't fight. They'd never faced real threats, never had to make survival choices, never lost enough to understand what the world outside required. And Rick knew this place would fall unless someone made it harder, made the people capable of defending what they'd built. The conflict between Rick and Pete, Alexandria's surgeon, who was also an abusive drunk, crystallized this tension. In the old world, you'd arrest Pete, have a trial, follow legal procedures. In the new world, Pete was dangerous and possessed valuable medical skills. Deanna wanted process. Rick wanted execution. When Pete killed Deanna's husband Reg in Season 5, Episode 16, Conquer, Rick executed Pete immediately. No trial, no process, just survival pragmatism. Rick's shower scene in Season 5, Episode 12, haunts me because it shows PTSD so clearly. He should be able to relax. The water is hot. He's clean for the first time in months. He's safe behind walls. But his body won't accept safety. He's tense, scanning, ready for violence. That's what the road did to him, made him unable to rest, even when rest was possible. The wolves attacked. Then the saviors discovered them, and the pattern held. Visibility breeds vulnerability. Alexandria's walls announced to anyone passing that valuable things were inside. The bigger and more successful the community, the more attractive it became to people who'd rather take than build. Deanna died during a Walker breach. Before dying, she passed leadership to Rick, acknowledged that his way, brutal as it was what Alexandria needed to survive. The old world leader stepping aside for the new world survivor. It was symbolic of what the whole show was arguing. The old values, old systems, old ways of organizing people, they can't survive the apocalypse. You need harder leadership, darker choices, the willingness to do what Deanna never could. But here's the question that keeps emerging. Was Alexandria worth defending? Should Rick's group have stayed hidden, stayed small, avoided the vulnerability that comes with building? Or was the attempt to preserve civilization even knowing it would attract threats worth the cost in lives and safety. I think the show wants us to grapple with both possibilities. Yes, Alexandria became a target. Yes, people died defending it. But also, children like Carl and Judith had stability there. Education, something like childhood. The community represented hope that humanity could rebuild, that the apocalypse wasn't permanent erasure of everything good. Rick's evolutioning Alexandria shows him trying to balance both truths. He strengthened defenses, trained people to fight, established harsher rules. But he also tried to maintain community, to give people reasons to hope beyond mere survival. He was trying to be both the protector Alexandria needed and the leader who preserved what made protection worthwhile. The Savior's discovery of Alexandria in Season 6, Episode 16, set up the show's next major conflict. And this time, the threat wouldn't just be about resources or territory. It would be about two completely different visions of how humanity should organize itself after the fall. Rick believed in communities working together, in cooperation despite differences, in trying to preserve choice and dignity. What was coming believed in hierarchy, control through fear, and the efficiency of tyranny. In Rick's group, having just started to believe Alexandria might actually work, was about to learn that belief itself can be weaponized. The pattern I'm seeing, every time Rick's group commits to a place, that commitment makes them vulnerable. But not committing staying mobile. Staying hidden means giving up on everything that makes survival meaningful. It's an impossible choice, and the show never tells Rick which answer is right. It just keeps showing him the cost of whichever choice he makes. Season 6, Episode 16, Last Day on Earth, and Season 7, Episode 1, The Day Will Come When You Won't Be, changed everything. Negan arrived with Lucille, his barbed wire-wrapped baseball bat, and murdered Abraham and Glenn in front of the group. Not for resources, not in battle, but as a demonstration, as theater, designed to break Rick completely. And it worked. Rick, who'd become so strong, so capable, so convinced he could protect his people, Negan shattered him, made him kneel, made him submit, made him accept a new reality where half of everything Alexandria produced belonged to the Saviors, where Negan's word was law, where resistance meant death. Negan's philosophy was explicit: control through terror, sustainability through tribute extraction. He'd identified thriving communities and forced them into a system where they produced for him or faced annihilation. The Saviors were organized, efficient, and Negan genuinely believed he was providing a service protection in exchange for resources. His brutality wasn't sadism, it was management. It was the logical endpoint of survival at scale. And here's what makes this era so morally complex. Negan wasn't entirely wrong. His system worked. Multiple communities survived under Savior control when they might have fallen to other threats. The tribute was harsh, but it was predictable. The violence was horrible, but it maintained order. From Negan's perspective, he was saving people by organizing them under strong leadership. Rick couldn't accept it, but he submitted temporarily because fighting would get more people killed. And watching Rick broken, watching him obey Negan's orders, watching the light go out of his eyes, that was more devastating than any death. Because Rick represented hope, and Negan had crushed that hope methodically and completely. Carl tried to kill Negan, snuck into the sanctuary, opened fire, was captured. And Negan's response was strange: respect. He saw in Carl what Rick used to be, what the apocalypse hadn't yet ground down: Negan took Carl on a tour, showed him the Century's operation, tried to explain his philosophy. And there was this weird mentorship dynamic, this recognition that Carl had potential that interested Negan. Carl's letters, written before his death in Season 8, Episode 9, Honor, became Rick's moral compass. In them, Carl articulated what Rick was losing, the belief that life could be more than survival, that mercy mattered, that building something good was worth attempting even when it seemed impossible. Carl wrote to Negan, too, asking him to stop, to find another way. His letter to Negan stated, "The way out is working together. It's forgiveness." Those letters would eventually crack Negan's certainty about his own righteousness. The pattern in this era: authoritarian efficiency versus democratic hope. Negan's system was efficient, brutal, exploitative, psychologically terrorizing, but it worked. Rick's vision of cooperative communities was messier, slower, required more faith in people. The show was asking, which model survives? And more importantly, which model should survive? Season 7 and 8's all-out war was Rick's answer. We fight. The coalition of Alexandria, Hilltop, and the Kingdom went to war against the Saviors, not just to free themselves, but to prove that people could organize without tyranny, that hope wasn't naive, that building something good was possible even when everything suggested otherwise. Carl died in Season 8, Episode 9, Honor, from a walker bite he got while helping a stranger. The bitter irony: he was trying to save someone, trying to prove that mercy still mattered, and it killed him. He gave Rick and Michonne his letters, his final words, his vision of what the world could be. And then Carl, who'd been with us since the beginning, who'd grown up in the apocalypse, died, proving Rick later paraphrased as, "There's gotta be something after." Rick spared Negan at the war's end, honored Carl's vision by choosing mercy over execution. It was a radical choice, one many in the group disagreed with. Maggie, especially Negan, had murdered her husband in front of her, and Rick's mercy felt like betrayal. But Rick was trying to prove that they could be better, that Carl's death meant something, that building the future Carl envisioned required becoming different than their enemies. The reflection here: Carl died, proving that survival alone isn't enough. And Rick spent the next phase trying to honor that truth, while everything around him kept arguing otherwise. The war ended, but the cost lingered. Alexandria, Hilltop, and the Kingdom had defeated the Saviors, but they'd lost people, resources, trust. Negan was imprisoned instead of executed. Rick's attempt to prove that justice could replace vengeance. But not everyone agreed with that choice. Season 9 brought a new threat: the Whisperers, and they represented something different from anything the group had faced before. Not competing for resources, not trying to control territory, the Whisperers rejected civilization entirely. Alpha and her people wore walker skin, walked among the dead, lived like animals. They decided that humanity itself was the problem, that trying to rebuild the old world was doomed, that survival meant embracing the new reality completely. Alpha's philosophy was ideological in a way the governor and Negan weren't. She didn't want to rule communities. She wanted to destroy the idea of communities. Walls were weakness. Agriculture was denial. Any attempt to preserve pre-apocalypse humanity was fighting against nature's new order. Season 9, Episode 15, The Calm Before, showed the Whisperers' brutality. Pike deaths: Henry, Enid, Tara, and others, heads on spikes, marking Alpha's border. She was destroying the next generation deliberately, killing the young people who represented hope for rebuilding. The message was clear. Stop trying to be what you were. Accept what you've become. Lydia, Alpha's daughter, chose differently. She'd been raised in the Whisperer's ideology, but chose to join the communities. Chose walls and agriculture and human connection over walking among the dead. Her choice represented the show's central question: what does humanity mean when civilization is gone? But the biggest loss came in Season 9, Episode 5, What Comes After, Rick's final episode. The bridge he'd been building to connect communities, symbolizing his vision of cooperation and shared future, exploded with him on it. The group thought he died. We learned he was taken by CRM helicopter to some unknown location, but to his family, to his people, Rick Grimes was gone, and his absence broke something. Michonne isolated Alexandria, pulled back from the other communities because trust had been shattered too many times. Daryl went to live alone by the river, searching for Rick, unable to accept that he was gone. Carol and Ezekiel's relationship fractured. The coalition Rick had built started falling apart without him to hold it together. The pattern here: without a common threat, communities fragment. War united them. Peace allowed old resentments, different priorities, competing visions to pull them apart. Rick's vision required constant work, constant choosing to cooperate, even when it was easier to isolate. Without Rick's leadership and moral force, that work became harder. In Season 10, Episode 12, Walk With Us, Negan killed Alpha, lured her to a cabin, and slit her throat. But Carol orchestrated the entire plan. She'd secretly freed Negan from his cell and sent him to infiltrate the Whisperers, specifically to assassinate Alpha. When Negan delivered Alpha's severed, reanimated head to Carol, she responded, "Took you long enough." Carol was the architect of Alpha's death, Negan the executioner, both earning tentative trust through this act. The Whisperers' leader was dead, but the damage to the community's unity remained. Beta, Alpha's second, led a massive herd against the communities in the Season 10 finale. The herd was defeated, the Whisperers scattered, but the cost was enormous. People died, resources were depleted, and the question lingered: how long could they keep doing this? How many times could they rebuild after each threat destroyed what they'd constructed? The theory I'm building is about cycles. Common enemies unite people because they provide clarity. Us versus them. Survival versus death. Clear moral lines. But peace is harder because it requires choosing cooperation when isolation seems safer. Choosing to help others when protecting your own is simpler. Choosing to build connections when every connection is a vulnerability. Rick believed in cooperation so deeply, he built a bridge, literally and metaphorically, to connect communities. But without him, that bridge exploded, and the communities drifted apart because the work of maintaining connection is constant, exhausting, and unrewarding until the moment you need each other again. The Whisperers asked, "Is clinging to the old world what destroys people? Should survivors accept the new reality instead of fighting to preserve what was?" And Lydia's answer, choosing community, choosing walls, choosing humanity, suggested that the fight to preserve something good might be worth it, even when it's costly, even when it seems futile. But without common threats to unite them, would the communities survive each other? Season 11 introduced the Commonwealth, a community of 50,000 people that had actually succeeded at rebuilding civilization. They had electricity, running water, organized government, currency, jobs, social services. From the outside, It looked like everything Rick had died trying to create. A functioning society, massive in scale, sustainable and stable. But underneath the polished surface was brutal inequality. Pamela Milton ruled through a rigid class system where your pre-outbreak profession determined your post-outbreak status. Former senators and executives lived in luxury. Former servers and laborers did dangerous work from minimal resources. Medical care was rationed based on class, not need. Ezekiel's storyline crystallized this injustice. He had thyroid cancer completely treatable with surgery. But as a worker in waste management, he didn't qualify for elective procedures. Not because the Commonwealth lacked surgeons or resources, but because his class didn't deserve that level of care. He was literally being left to die from a treatable condition because of bureaucratic hierarchy. Eugene, Yumiko, and Princess navigated the system with varying levels of success. Eugene found love with Stephanie, found purpose teaching. Yumiko discovered her brother was alive in the Commonwealth. Princess struggled with the rules and structure after so long surviving on her own terms. The Commonwealth offered stability, but that stability came with a price of submission to an unjust system. And here's the theory question this raises. Can civilization be rebuilt without repeating the old world's mistakes? The Commonwealth preserved infrastructure, organization, the capacity to support tens of thousands of people. But they also preserved class inequality, the idea that some lives matter more than others, the systems that let wealthy people thrive while poor people die. Pamela Milton genuinely believed she was preserving something valuable. She'd maintain order when everything else collapsed. She'd build a system that kept 50,000 people fed, sheltered, alive. From her perspective, inequality was a necessary cost of sustainability. You needed hierarchy to organize that many people. You needed administrators, rules, consequences for disobedience. But Rick's group, having fought through years of apocalypse, couldn't accept that survival required injustice. They'd built Alexandria, Hilltop, communities that tried to maintain equality and dignity even when resources were scarce. Seeing the Commonwealth succeed through exploitation felt like betrayal of everything they'd fought for. The pattern here. Large communities require hierarchy, and hierarchy breeds injustice. Small communities like Alexandria could maintain relative equality because everyone knew everyone, because decisions affected people you cared about personally. But at 50,000 people, you needed administrators, needed rules that applied to masses of strangers, needed systems that inevitably valued some people over others. Is the Commonwealth the future or a warning? That's the question Season 11 grappled with. Eugene argued it was better than anything they'd built. More people saved, more resources preserved, actual civilization instead of struggling survival camps. Others argued that survival under exploitation isn't worth it, that Rick didn't die for this, that they'd rather struggle in small communities than thrive in unjust systems. Season 11's finale left the Commonwealth's fate somewhat ambiguous. Reforms were promised, the class system was challenged, but the fundamental question remained. Can you organize 50,000 people without creating hierarchies that oppress some for the benefit of others? My theory is that the Commonwealth represents civilization's return, but also its warning. Yes, large-scale society is possible after apocalypse. Yes, infrastructure can be rebuilt, organization can emerge, humanity can create something massive and sustainable. But also, those massive systems seem to inevitably create inequality. The price of civilization at scale might be injustice for the people at the bottom. Rick's vision was different. smaller communities cooperating, networks instead of empires, systems that preserved choice and dignity even when they were less efficient. But Rick's vision required constant work, constant choosing cooperation, constant rejecting the efficiency of authoritarianism. The Commonwealth proved that rebuilding is possible, but it didn't prove that rebuilding would be good. And that distinction matters. Because if the only way forward is systems that exploit, then maybe the future isn't worth fighting for. Maybe small communities struggling to maintain equality are morally superior to large communities that succeed through hierarchy. Or maybe that's idealism, and the Commonwealth represents hard realism about what human organization requires at scale. Maybe Rick's dream was beautiful but unsustainable, and the choices between Commonwealth-style civilization or scattered survival camps, with nothing in between. The question lingers: is the Commonwealth the future or a warning? And I think the show wants us to sit with both possibilities, to understand that rebuilding is complicated, that there might not be good answers, only choices between different kinds of compromise. When the main show ended, the characters scattered, but their stories continued in spin-offs that explored what comes after the war, after Rick, after the attempt to rebuild civilization under the Commonwealth's model. And this diaspora model reveals something important about what the future looks like. Daryl Dixon went to France. The how and why aren't fully clear yet, but thematically, it makes sense. Daryl never fit comfortably in settlements. Even in Alexandria, even when he had a house and a role, he kept his motorcycle ready, kept his skills sharp, stayed prepared to leave. France represents displacement, being far from everything familiar, having to build new connections in a completely foreign context. The pattern with Daryl has always been about found family over place. He doesn't need walls or infrastructure. He needs people he cares about, and when those people are gone or scattered, he moves. France might be where he finds new family, new purpose, or it might just be where he processes the loss of what he had. Dead City brings Maggie and Negan together in Manhattan, forced to cooperate despite their history. Negan murdered Glenn. That's not something you forgive, not something you move past. But survival requires working with people you hate, requires putting aside vengeance for practical necessity. The Dead City setting urban apocalypse years later shows a world that hasn't gotten better. If anything, cities are more dangerous now, more desperate, more ruthlessly Darwinian. Maggie and Negan's forced cooperation asks, can you rebuild trust after unforgivable acts? Negan's redemption arc in the main show was about him earning tentative acceptance, proving through actions that he'd changed. But Maggie never forgave him, never accepted him, and Dead City explores whether that matters. Whether you need forgiveness to work together, whether pragmatic cooperation is enough, whether some wounds are too deep to ever heal. The Ones Who Live finally gave us Rick and Michonne's story. Rick was taken by the CRM, the Civic Republic military, the most powerful organization we've seen in the post-apocalypse world. They have helicopters, military organization, resources that suggest they're rebuilding at a scale that makes the Commonwealth look small. And Rick was trapped in that system, unable to escape, unable to return to his family. Michonne spent years searching for him, found evidence he was alive, refused to give up. And when they reunited, they had to fight together to escape the CRM's control, to get back to Alexandria, to their children, to the life they'd built. The theory here is about networks replacing nations. The main show tried to tell a story about communities rebuilding civilization in one location. But the spin-offs suggest the future is more dispersed characters scattered across different locations, connected by relationships and history, but not by proximity or shared governance. Nuclear family gave way to found family, which is now giving way to scattered individuals reconnecting across distances. It's not what Rick envisioned. He wanted communities working together in one place. But maybe his vision was too centralized, too dependent on everyone staying together. Maybe the actual future is people building meaning wherever they end up, connected by shared history but not bound to shared location. Daryl in France, Maggie and Negan in Manhattan, Rick and Michonne fighting the CRM. These are individuals or small groups navigating complicated situations far from the communities they used to know. They're not building permanent homes. They're making temporary meaning, finding purpose in the moment, staying connected to their past without being trapped by it. The pattern I'm seeing. They stopped looking for permanent homes and started making temporary meaning. The search for sanctuary, for the safe place they could finally stop running, that search nearly destroyed them. Every sanctuary fell. Every home was temporary. The farm, the prison, even Alexandria kept nearly falling. So maybe the lesson is accepting impermanence, building knowing it won't last, connecting knowing you'll eventually separate, living in the moment, because the moment is all you have guaranteed. The spin-off suggests that the future isn't about rebuilding the old world's nations and cities. It's about individuals and small groups surviving, adapting, connecting temporarily, and moving on when necessary. It's a more fragmented future, but maybe a more resilient one, because scattered people can't all fall at once. Networks are harder to destroy than centralized communities. Judith, RJ, and Herschel Jr., to the children, raised entirely in the apocalypse. They might build something different than their parents tried, because they don't remember the old world. They're not trying to recreate what fell. They're building from scratch, with no nostalgia for civilizations that failed, with no attachment to systems that collapsed. Maybe that's hope. The next generation building something new because they're not burdened by trying to rebuild what was lost. After 11 seasons and multiple spin-offs, certain patterns emerge clearly enough that we can build a theory about what The Walking Dead is really saying. And I think the core message is this. The story was never about surviving the end of the world. It was about what we become after, about what humanity means when all the structures that used to define it are gone. Rick started as a deputy sheriff who believed in law, order, institutions, the promise that authority figures were there to protect people. By the time he disappeared, he'd become something else entirely. A leader who'd learned that survival sometimes requires tyranny, that protecting people sometimes requires violence, that the old world's rules don't apply when the world has fundamentally changed. But Rick also never fully abandoned his idealism. Even after Shane, after the governor, after Negan broke him, Rick kept trying to build communities based on cooperation and hope. He kept believing that mercy mattered, that people could be better, that civilization could be rebuilt without repeating the old world's mistakes. Carl's letters reinforced this, reminded him that building something good was worth the cost. Carol's arc is almost the opposite trajectory. She started as a victim, abused by Ed, dependent on others, barely surviving. The apocalypse freed her, gave her strength, skills, the power to protect herself and others. But it also required her to become hard, to do terrible things, to sacrifice pieces of her humanity for survival. Her transformations with each location and crisis show someone who's learned to adapt so completely that she's lost track of who she actually is beneath all the survival personas. Daryl rejected settlement entirely. He helped communities, protected people he cared about, but he never fully integrated. Even in Alexandria, he kept his motorcycle ready, kept his distance, stayed prepared to leave. For Darrell, home was never a place. It was people. And when those people scattered, he scattered too. His isolation by the river after Rick disappeared, his eventual journey to France, these show someone who's accepted that permanence is impossible, that attachment to places leads to loss. Negan's redemption arc asked whether people can fundamentally change, whether someone who did monstrous things can become good, whether redemption is earned through actions or granted through forgiveness. The show's answer was complicated. Negan changed, genuinely tried to be better, earned tentative acceptance from some. But others, Maggie especially, never forgave him. And maybe that's the honest answer. Some wounds are too deep, some acts too unforgivable, and redemption doesn't erase history. The alternative readings of villains are worth considering. Were the Governor, Negan, and Alpha just adapting faster? Were they responding to reality more honestly than Rick's idealism allowed? The Governor saw that safety required consolidating power and eliminating threats. Negan saw that organizing communities under strong authority was more sustainable than cooperative democracy. Alpha saw that clinging to the old world was what destroyed people. They were wrong about methodology, wrong about the value of human life, wrong about whether the ends justified their means. But were they wrong about the fundamental challenge of survival at scale? I don't think the show gives us a comfortable answer to that. The Commonwealth raised the same questions in a different form. Can you organize 50,000 people without hierarchy? Can you rebuild civilization without inequality? Can you preserve infrastructure and services while maintaining human dignity for everyone? The Commonwealth said no, you need classes, need administrators, need some people with more power than others. Rick's vision said, yes, cooperation and equality are worth fighting for, even when they're harder. Season 11's finale suggested reforms, changes, the possibility of the Commonwealth becoming more just. But it didn't definitively answer whether large-scale egalitarian civilization is possible after apocalypse. And here's what I think the show was building toward. Maybe both answers are valid. Maybe small communities can maintain equality and dignity, but they're vulnerable and limited. Maybe large communities can be stable and powerful, but they require hierarchies that breed injustice. Maybe the choice isn't between right and wrong, but between different kinds of compromise, different costs you're willing to accept. The moral questions that remain: what would you have done at each turning point? When Shane argued for pragmatism over hope, was he wrong or just honest? When Rick spared Negan, was that mercy or weakness? When Michonne isolated Alexandria, was that protecting her people or betraying Rick's vision? When the Commonwealth offered stability for the price of submission, was accepting or rejecting that offer the morally correct choice? I think the show wants us to struggle with these questions, to understand that the apocalypse doesn't provide clear moral answers, that survival requires compromises that comfortable people never have to consider. Can you rebuild without repeating the patterns that failed? That's the ultimate question. The old world fell. Its systems, its inequalities, its failures all contributed to collapse. If we rebuild using the same patterns, hierarchies, authoritarianism, valuing some lives over others, do we just set up the next collapse? Or is that idealism? And the hard truth is that human organization always creates hierarchies, always values some people over others. And the best we can do is try to minimize injustice while accepting we can't eliminate it. The show explored both possibilities, without telling us which is true. The final season brought the communities full circle in many ways. They'd started as scattered survivors, trying to find safety. They'd built communities, lost communities, rebuilt. They'd fought walkers, humans, their own worst instincts. And by season 11, they faced the question, what comes next? For Judith and RJ, Rick's children, the apocalypse isn't something that happened. It's the only world they've ever known. Judith wears Carl's hat, carries Rick's python, embodies the legacy of her family's fight to stay good in a world that punished goodness. But she's not trying to rebuild the old world because she never knew it. She's building something new based on stories she's been told and lessons she's learned. RJ is even younger, even more removed from pre-apocalypse reality. The old world is mythology to him, stories about phones and cars and grocery stores. He's being raised by people who knew that world, but he'll never experience it himself. And maybe that's an advantage. Maybe growing up without nostalgia for what was lost means building something genuinely new instead of recreating failed systems. Herschel Jr., Maggie's son, is named for the man who represented holding onto humanity through faith and compassion. The name carries weight, expectation, legacy. But Herschel Jr. will define what that name means in this world, not the one his namesake knew. The theory here is that they'll build something new because they're not trying to recreate what fell. Rick spent years trying to rebuild civilization as he remembered it. Communities, cooperation, systems that preserved old world values. But he was constantly fighting against the reality that the world had fundamentally changed, that old solutions didn't fit new problems. The next generation doesn't have that burden. They can build from scratch, create societies designed for the world as it is, rather than mourning the world that was. Maybe they'll avoid the Commonwealth's mistakes because they never knew the old world systems that the Commonwealth was trying to preserve. Maybe they'll create something genuinely different. Or maybe they'll repeat the same patterns, because human nature doesn't change even when circumstances do. Maybe hierarchies and inequalities emerge not from nostalgia for the old world, but from fundamental aspects of how humans organize when resources are scarce and threats are constant. The pattern across all 11 seasons is this: survival led to meaning, led to legacy, led to hope transformed. Rick survived the outbreak, found meaning in protecting his people, left a legacy in his children and communities, and his hope that people could be better. That civilization could be rebuilt, transformed into something his children carry forward differently. Carl's letters captured this evolution. Rick later paraphrased Carl's vision as, "There's gotta be something after." And the entire show was about exploring what after means. Is it rebuilding? Creating beauty? Maintaining humanity? Preserving knowledge? Loving people despite knowing you'll lose them? All of those? Something else entirely? I think the answer is different for each character and each viewer. For Rick, after meant building communities and defending them. For Daryl, it meant staying true to himself and the people he cared about. For Carol, it meant surviving while trying to not lose herself completely. For Negan, it meant atoning for past acts through present choices. For Michonne, it meant searching for the person she loved even when everyone said he was dead. The story wasn't about finding the perfect place, or the perfect system, or the perfect answer to how humanity rebuilds. It was about people trying, failing, trying again, losing what they built, building anyway. It was about the stubborn refusal to accept that survival alone is enough, even when survival requires sacrifices that make you question whether you're still the person you used to be. Communities fell, the farm, the prison, the kingdom. Even Alexandria came close multiple times, but people persisted. They rebuilt, reconnected, started over. And that persistence, that refusal to give up even when giving up made logical sense, that's what the show was celebrating. Not success, not victory, not even survival, really. Just the decision to keep trying. The emotional close here is about transformation. Survival led to meaning, led to legacy, led to hope, transformed. The hope Rick started with that institutions would save them, that civilization could continue unchanged, that hope died at the CDC. But it transformed into a different hope. That people could build something new. That found family mattered more than blood. That choosing to be good had value even when the world punished goodness. And that transformed hope passed to the next generation, where it might transform again into something Rick never imagined, but would recognize as carrying forward what he fought for. Maybe the story was never about surviving the end. Maybe it was about what we become after, about whether we let catastrophe destroy our humanity or use it to discover humanity we didn't know we had, about whether we rebuild or build something entirely new, about whether we survive alone or together, whether we hold on to the past or create a different future. The show doesn't tell us which is right. It shows us people making different choices, suffering different consequences, finding different kinds of meaning. And it trusts us to sit with the complexity, to understand that there aren't easy answers, that the question of how to be human after the world ends is one every survivor has to answer for themselves. It may be that uncertainty, that acknowledgement of complexity, that refusal to provide simple moral clarity, maybe that's the most honest thing the show could have done. There's a moment I keep thinking about when I consider the entire arc of The Walking Dead. It's not a big moment, not a dramatic death or shocking reveal. It's Rick in Season 5, touching his deputy sheriff's badge before entering Alexandria. A small gesture, almost unconscious. That badge used to mean authority, protection, the promise that someone was in charge and keeping people safe. By Season 5, it meant something else. A reminder of who he used to be before the world taught him that badges don't protect anyone. Rick's evolution from deputy sheriff to dictator to builder to missing figure represents the show's journey through different models of leadership. Deputy Rick believed in law and process. Dictator Rick believed in making hard choices without consensus. Builder Rick believed in cooperation and shared vision. And Rick's absence forced communities to answer, can we maintain what he built without him? The answer was complicated. Some things fell apart. The coalition fractured without his unifying presence. But some things persisted. Alexandria survived. Relationships endured. The vision of something better than mere survival continued. Rick's physical absence didn't erase his influence, didn't invalidate what he'd built, but it tested whether those structures depended on him personally or had become sustainable without him. Carol's transformations tell a different story about identity under pressure. She's been so many different people: abused housewife, protective mother, ruthless survivor, domestic performer, isolated wanderer, vengeful warrior. Each transformation was adaptation to circumstances, becoming whoever she needed to be to survive that particular challenge. But at some point, when you've been so many different people, do you lose track of who you actually are? I think Carol's arc is about the cost of surviving by constantly reinventing yourself. She's alive because she adapted, but the price of that adaptation is a fractured sense of self, uncertainty about which version of Carol is real and which are performances. And maybe that's the honest answer. Maybe under enough pressure, over enough time, identity itself becomes fluid. Maybe there is no real Carol beneath all the survival personas, just choices accumulated over years. Darrow's rejection of settlement, his comfort in wilderness, his eventual journey to France, this represents another response to the same pressure. Instead of transforming like Carol, Darrow stayed fundamentally himself. He helped communities but never fully joined them. He loved people but never needed places. His identity remained stable because he never tried to fit into structures that required changing who he was. But that stability came at the cost of connection. Darrow's relationships are deep but few. He's often alone, often choosing isolation over the compromises that community requires. He survived by staying true to himself, but the price is loneliness. Negan's redemption arc asked whether fundamental change is possible or whether we're trapped by our worst actions. Negan genuinely tried to be better, genuinely helped communities, earned tentative trust from some. But Maggie never forgave him for Glenn's murder. And that's honest. Some acts are unforgivable, some wounds too deep. And trying to be better doesn't erase what you've done. The question isn't whether Negan changed, he did. It's whether change is enough. Whether earning redemption through actions is possible when the people you hurt won't grant forgiveness. And the show's answer is complicated. Yes, you can change. No, that doesn't mean people have to forgive you. And you live with that tension. The alternative readings of villains remain uncomfortable, but worth considering. Were they wrong about everything? The governor consolidated power and eliminated threats brutal, but arguably necessary for Woodbury's survival. Negan organized communities and prevented chaos, terrorizing, but his system worked. Alpha rejected civilization's lies and lived in brutal honesty, monstrous. But was she entirely wrong about what humanity had become? They were wrong about meanings, wrong about the value of individual lives, wrong to justify atrocity for community survival. But were they wrong about the fundamental challenges, about how difficult organization is at scale, how dangerous trust can be, how costly hope becomes when it makes you vulnerable? I don't think so. I think they identified real problems and proposed terrible solutions. And the tragedy is that Rick's group struggled to find better solutions, struggled to prove that you could organize without tyranny, that cooperation could work, that hope wasn't naive. Sometimes they succeeded. Alexandria survived. The coalition defeated the saviors. The Commonwealth was challenged to reform. But success was always temporary, always costly, always requiring sacrifice that made you question whether the goal was worth the price. What would you have done at each turning point? That's not rhetorical. When Shane argued for leaving the CDC's comfort, would you have listened? When Rick wanted to spare Negan, would you have supported him? When the Commonwealth offered stability for submission, would you have accepted? These aren't simple questions with obvious answers. They're genuine moral dilemmas where reasonable people disagree. The Commonwealth represents the final test of whether large-scale civilization can be rebuilt without repeating the old world's mistakes. The season 11 finale suggests reforms and change and the possibility of doing better. But it doesn't guarantee success, doesn't promise that the Commonwealth won't eventually collapse under its own inequalities. And maybe that uncertainty is the point. Maybe the show is saying, we don't know if humanity can rebuild justly. We don't know if cooperation can overcome our worst instincts. We don't know if hope is wisdom or delusion. All we know is that some people keep trying, keep choosing to build rather than destroy, keep believing that the attempt matters even when success isn't guaranteed. That's not a comfortable answer, but it might be an honest one. So here we are, more than a decade later, looking back at the entire story of The Walking Dead. And what stays with me isn't the walker kills, or the shocking deaths, or even the major plot points. It's Rick's deputy badge in Judith's hand. She found it somewhere, maybe in Rick's belongings. Maybe Michonne gave it to her. Maybe it's been passed down as a family heirloom. The badge is dirty, tarnished, bent. It doesn't shine like it once did. And Judith doesn't know what deputy sheriffs were, doesn't understand the old world authority structure the badge represented. But she knows what it meant to her father: protect people. That transformation is what the entire series was building toward. The badge started as a symbol of institutional authority, the old world's promise that someone was in charge, that law and order would be maintained, that civilization's structures would protect citizens. Rick wore it, believing in that promise. But the institutions failed. The government fell. The CDC self-destructed. And the badge became an abandoned relic of a world that didn't exist anymore. Carl inherited it in a different sense, not literally wearing it, but carrying forward what it represented to Rick. The responsibility to protect people, to lead with purpose, to be someone others could depend on. Carl's letters to Rick and Negan carried that forward, the vision that cooperation and forgiveness could work, that there had to be something beyond mere survival. And now, Judith holds it. A child raised entirely in the apocalypse, who knows walkers and communities and survival, but not phones or cars or deputy sheriffs. To her, the badge isn't about law enforcement. It's about choosing to protect people when no one makes you, when no institution requires it, when you could just focus on your own survival, but decide that other people matter too. That's the hope marker for rebuilding. Not rebuilding the old world, but that world is gone. Its systems failed. Its promises broken. But building something new that carries forward the essential truth. We protect each other. Not because authority demands it, not because systems enforce it, but because we choose to. Because community and connection and caring about people beyond our immediate circle, those things have value, even when they're costly. The pattern across all 11 seasons was about transformation. Authority became abandonment, became inheritance, became hope. Rick's badge meant institutional power, then meant nothing, then meant legacy, then meant possibility. The symbol stayed the same, but what it represented evolved with each generation. And I think that's what the story was really saying. It's not about returning to what was. It's not about rebuilding the old world systems and hoping they work better this time. It's about building something new that learns from what failed, that carries forward what mattered, that creates different structures for a fundamentally different world. The communities fell farm, prison, kingdom, but people persisted. They rebuilt, reconnected, started over. Not the same way, not in the same places, but with the same stubborn refusal to accept that survival alone is enough. That refusal is what defines humanity in this story. Not intelligence, not civilization's trappings, not technology or government or any institutional structure. Just the decision to keep building, keep connecting, keep trying to create meaning beyond mere existence. Judith, RJ, Herschel Jr., They're being raised by people who knew the old world and watched it fall. But the children themselves only know this world. They're not burdened by nostalgia, not trying to recreate what their parents lost. They can build from scratch, create societies designed for reality rather than memory. And maybe that's where hope lives, in the next generation's freedom from the past. They'll make different mistakes, face different challenges, but they're not repeating the old patterns because they never learned them. They're writing their own story with their parents' lessons as guidance, not chains. The world ended. That's not metaphor or exaggeration. The civilization that existed for thousands of years collapsed in weeks. Billions died. Everything that seemed permanent governments, cities, the confident assumption that tomorrow would resemble today, all of it gone. But the story of trying to be good didn't end. The story of protecting people, building communities, choosing cooperation over competition, believing that others matter, that story persisted through the fall and into whatever comes after. Rick's badge in Judith's hand says, "We're not what we were, but we're not what the apocalypse tried to make us either. We're something new, building something different, carrying forward what mattered while leaving behind what failed." Is that enough? Is that success? I don't know. The show doesn't tell us. It ends with communities still standing but uncertain, with characters scattered but connected, with hope transformed but not extinguished. It ends the way it lived, without easy answers, without guarantees, without the comfort of knowing how things turn out. But also, with people still trying, still building, still choosing to protect each other when they could just focus on themselves, still believing that the attempt matters, even when success isn't certain. Maybe the story was never about surviving the end. Maybe it was about what we become after, about whether we let catastrophe destroy our humanity or use it to discover humanity we didn't know we had, about whether we repeat the patterns that failed or build something genuinely new. The walkers keep walking, but so do the survivors. And in that parallel motion, the dead moving without purpose and the living moving despite uncertainty, maybe there's something worth holding on to. Not certainty, not comfort, not the promise that everything will be okay. Just the decision to keep walking, to keep building, to keep trying to be good even when the world doesn't reward goodness, to keep protecting people even when protection isn't guaranteed to work. The world ended, but the story of trying to be good didn't. And maybe when everything else is gone, that's what endures.